Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Nicola, for the invitation today. So I'm going to give you a bit of an insight into the work that I do across multiple different spaces. So originally in the diving space or in aviation, and then moving into diving. So a bit of a deep dive into human factors and just culture, and as already sort of described, is the need and want to move beyond the last person to touch it. Anybody who's involved in any sort of form of system safety will recognize that the people that are at the sharp end have inherited broken systems, and they're trying to do the best they can with the resources they've got. So my background, I did 25 years in the Royal Air Force flying on Hercules transport aircraft. Amassed about 2,000 flying hours, was a flight instructor and a flight commander looking after what I describe as 125 grown-up children on the squadron. I then moved into technical space. I did a master's degree in aerospace systems, and then did some flight trials work, some research and development work, and then some procurement systems engineering work, and then left the front line or left the Air Force in 2015, and then started to work in oil and gas and in construction and healthcare, basically high-risk industries. Around 2005 is where I got interested in bringing human factors into the diving space. I now deliver online programs, self-paced and live webinars, face-to-face programs. I've written a book. There's two other books in the offing as well, and have developed an instructor group around the world that delivers, in effect, crew resource management and non-technical skills into the diving space. Originally, sports diving, technical diving, but also now working in the military diving space and the commercial diving space. I've run two fatal diving accident inquiries, one for the UK Ministry of Defence and one for the New Zealand Defence Force. And then my other sort of area is in the academic area. So I started a part-time self-funded PhD in 2012, gave that up 6 years later because it wasn't going anywhere and costing me a lot of money. But then in 2022, I signed up and did another master's degree at Lund University in Sweden called, well, it was the Human Factors and Systems Safety Masters. My thesis was what happens underwater stays underwater, trying to explore this idea of storytelling to learn. So I sit with my foot in these three camps, which gives me a diverse view as to what's going on. But I don't just do work in the diving space. I work in any sort of high-risk industry because fundamentally people are people. And what I'm going to start doing now as we go through this is tell three short stories from different domains and actually then bring them together in terms of the thread that you can take away, and then what that'll cover some of the theory side, and then I'll give you some practical tools and links that you can follow to help build your knowledge and ultimately make the world a better and safer place. So 4 weeks ago in the Maldives, five recreational divers descended to around 50 to 60 meters and entered a cave system, or that's where the bodies were recovered. And unfortunately, all five of those died. So all we have is, or the authorities have, is the GoPro footage and the data from the dive computers. And this was a major event in the diving space, 5 people dying at once, and it made international media presence. And in the diving community, the blame started straight away. How could they do this? What were they doing? What were they thinking? It was obvious that this was going to end up as a fatality in this space. And then unfortunately, within 2 days, there was another fatality of a Maldivian military diver who died in the recovery activity. And so people sitting there going, why did the military diver dive to the depth without the equipment, without the gases, without the training to go and do something like this? And I spent a fair amount of time writing articles online to explain how the system behaves. What does normal look like? Asking different questions to really understand what social, what cultural, what technical, what environmental conditions lead people to make the decisions they did. And for the military diver, it's pretty easy. Having spent 25 years in, the government says we have to do something. Military, do something. The military says we can do this. We've got this capability. And then they delegate or abdicate, depending on how you look at it, the authority down to the local level, and then you end up with a military diver whose identity is around doing good stuff, getting stuff done. And we can do this, we'll make it happen. And so there are lots of social cognitive pressures that lead to a situation. And I wrote a blog recently about this multiple fatalities event and said the structure behind these multiple fatalities was actually not different. It's not that unusual to have people diving to those depths, to go diving into caves without line, without, we're basically exceeding limits in what was going on. So the structure was normal, but the scale was very different. And it's trying to shift that mindset. So that's the first story. And the next one is about this lady here called Redonda Vort, who was charged with homicide following the death of one of her patients. And at the bottom here, there's a link to a fantastic resource that looks at this healthcare system in much more detail. So Redonda was wearing 3 hats on this particular day because of understaffing in the hospital. She overrode the protection mechanisms on the drug dispensing system because of the way that it's set up. And overriding the protection measures was normal because actually you couldn't get the job done. The drugs themselves were not clearly identified as being very different. She had to use a chemical name rather than a trade name for the medicine. She was on her own. She was also coaching somebody else, i.e., when I mean she was on her own, there wasn't anybody else to supervise what she was doing. She was actually supervising somebody else. And she administered this drug, which she thought was going to be a sedative because the patient was in an MRI machine, was really stressed and was sort of close to panic. And actually what she'd given was a paralyzing agent. And because she was busy doing other things, multiple tasking, that she left the patient and the patient died in the MRI machine. And she'd realized what happened later on. She'd reported it and the hospital had said, okay, it's a medication error. A year later, a Freedom of Information Act request was made and she was charged with homicide. And this kicked off a massive thing in the States and across medicine in the UK as well, because the system is broken and people are trying to do the best they can with the resources they've got. And eventually she was acquitted, but there was a big thing of saying, actually, if you're going to criminalize human error in the healthcare system, healthcare is going to collapse even more. So I drew parallels of a system failure back to the diving space. And then we look at the Challenger loss in which everybody died. And it's often broken down to the O-ring failed. And that's the easy proximal cause, that the O-ring failed in the cold weather conditions, allowed hot gases to escape. And then the fuel tank and the rocket boosters and the shuttle disintegrated at speed. And often we talk about this as this normalization of deviance, which I'll cover on the next slide, as they were continually breaking the rules. But the important piece from the book that Diane Vaughan wrote was actually, it wasn't that the rules were being broken, the rules were being rewritten to deal with the commercial and scheduling pressures that were in place. Challenger was the point at which it had gone from an experimental space platform where we had astronauts. This is the first one where a civilian was traveling, and that was a teacher that was going to be on board. And their internal rationale for managing risk had moved from the flight directors, the engineering teams, to say, give me the evidence to say why it is safe to launch, to a point where they said, give me the evidence to say why we shouldn't launch. And the burden of proof to say why we shouldn't do something, because you're trying to disprove a negative, is really high. And on the night before they lost the platform, there was a discussion and it went back and forth. And there was a comment made to one of the engineers, take your engineering hat off and put your management hat on, because there was massive commercial and schedule pressures riding this. They'd overpromised capabilities and they were under-delivering, and they were way behind schedule. So we should look at this in this context of normalization of deviance, is actually what's going on, what's shifting. Just because something hasn't gone wrong catastrophically, it doesn't mean that it's safe. And in fact, on the very first launch they'd had, the O-ring that failed with Challenger had already got some marks, some burn marks in it. And what they did is they subjected that O-ring to high pressure, high temperature testing, and it didn't fail. So they got confirmation bias. They'd validated what they were doing was the right thing to do. Then NASA didn't learn. They then lost Columbia through a bunch of other faster, better, cheaper mindsets that were going on there. And people were working, coming up with solutions to solve scheduling problems, technical problems. Humans are awesome like this. What they weren't aware of was how much of the margin they'd had, they were eroding. So normalization of deviance from Diane Vaughan is worth looking at, and you can get hold of, or if you can't find it, Chapter 8 of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board report talking about history as a cause, the history behind the decisions and how that set both Challenger and Columbia up for failure. Another way of looking at drift is from this guy here, Scott Snook, and he talked about the shoot down of 2 Black Hawk helicopters in northern Iraq by 2 US Air Force F-15s. And he talks about it in 3 different domains. He talks about the pilots of the F-15s and how it made sense for them to identify 2 Black Hawk helicopters as if they were Hind attack helicopters from Iraq. He talks about the AWACS crew, the Airborne Warning and Control Coordination Service. So in its sort of system, in their space, they were controlling air, what was happening. And then also the helicopter crews, the fact that they were not in the tasking order, that they had old equipment that hadn't been updated. They were operating on different frequencies. Because of their adaptive nature of their tasking, people didn't really know where they were. And from detection of the helicopters to handing over to another controller, to then losing the picture and then getting it back again, vectoring the F-15s on, and then them shooting them down, having visually identified these aircraft, was in the order of 2 or 3 minutes. That was it. And so what he was talking about is when we create systems, and I'll come on to the next slide, when we create systems where we're used to operating with a bit of slack, we've got some loose coupling, when we collapse time, and we've got a really short period of time, there is no margin for maneuver. And the quote here from Scott Snook is one of the really powerful bits near the end of the book, where he talks about, I was looking for the culprit. I was looking for the guilty party, the individual who basically we could pin it on. But he said, as I started to dig into this, I realized it's ordinary people or normal people in normal ways, in normal organizations. And what happened is this event emerged from what's going on. It was not linear. It's not a 5 whys solvable problem. It's really complex and interactive. Now, I've recently finished running the first investigation program, systems investigation program for the diving industry. And we talked about this practical drift and coupling, and it was difficult to get this across. So I've taken a slide from that and I'm sharing it here because it's understanding what do these things mean. So in a diving context, we would have a minimum gas, a minimum volume or a minimum pressure of gas that would allow 2 of us to share gas and ascend from depth to the surface, where one of us had run out and when I'm now breathing off their cylinder using a spare regulator. But we never actually normally practice this to understand, are those values acceptable or not? And what are the problems that we might face? So as a consequence, gas limits our bottom time. So what we might do is erode that because we want to take a photo, we want to explore a wreck or a reef or a bit more of a cave, and we sit there going, it'll be okay, it'll be okay. And so we gradually erode that margin, which, as long as nothing goes wrong, everything is fine because we make it back to the surface. We also then have another scenario where people don't necessarily know how to navigate their way around a shipwreck on the bottom. Visibility can be 2 or 3 meters, it might be 10 meters. And often we don't lay a line and we don't provide a breadcrumb trail to get back to our anchor line to ascend back to the vessel. And in the majority of cases, it doesn't really matter. If I get lost on the wreck, I can just ascend as long as I'm not in a shipping channel and the boat can come and pick me up. That's not normally an issue. Then equipment, you know, divers are invariably or notoriously tight. They don't want to spend their own money. And so when equipment breaks, as long as it's manageable, it's all okay. And each one of those things is manageable because we have spare capacity. We have loose coupling in the system. So if something goes wrong, it's not normally catastrophic. I can resolve that in space and time. And so things don't go wrong, we don't capture it, and therefore we don't learn. But if we consider that we are at the far end of the wreck, I have an equipment failure, which means I now have to share gas with my buddy. I've got a heightened breathing rate. He's also had a heightened breathing rate and he's eroded his gas margins. And we're now trying to ascend in free water, having not done this before. And time is now really restricted. We don't have much space to maneuver. And this is what a tightly coupled system is about. So invariably in your own spaces, whatever domains you're in, you're going to have slack in the system. And the problem is in a commercial environment, slack costs you money because it doesn't generate revenue. And so you sit there and go, can we cut a little bit off? Can we cut a little bit off? Can we cut a little bit off? And I know the safety profession really struggles with making this argument because the pushback comes, it's all gone okay. Why do we need X to be as safe as we can? And that then becomes almost a moral thing rather than a technical thing. So when things go wrong, what happens is stories get told, rumors get told. Social media can be a double-edged sword in this space. Internal sort of whispers shift the story. But invariably, we have a first story that comes out. That is the one that we hear first. It's simple, it's linear, it's full of counterfactuals, should have, could have, would have, failed to, human error, complacency. All of these are attributes that really don't contribute to learning. They often make us feel good, that's fine, but it doesn't contribute to learning, and it massively shapes what people perceive going on afterwards. The first story told is the one that we anchor to. But in reality, we have messy, multiple stories, not just one story, multiple second stories. And these show the trade-offs that happen in this space. So in the Maldives case, there would have been some trade-offs. Are we collecting data? What are the pressures that are there? We've got social pressures involved. For the Redonda Vort case, the healthcare system pretty much anywhere does way more than it's expected to do. And mistakes happen. Sometimes they end up with catastrophic outcomes. If you look at the Challenger story, it often boils down to they failed because they allowed the O-rings to happen and somebody didn't say anything the night before. Diane Vaughan's book is about 450, 500 pages long, and it talks about the deep history behind this. And that's the challenge for us, is that as professionals in this space, we have to go and find those second stories, because it's really easy to judge that incompetence. Nobody comes to work to do a bad job. They're trying to do the best they can with the resources they've got. And if you think that's a problem, then it's an HR issue, not an ops and safety issue. So a way of explaining how do we find those gaps is this idea about closing the gap between work as imagined and work as done. So I might have a plan for an operation. I'm going to think in my head what that task might be. And the beauty of humans is we're creative, imaginative. We can solve all sorts of our problems in our head. And then we have to write it down. And when we write it down, that's always a subset of work as imagined. It's often based around optimal conditions because we've got limited resources. We don't have all the time and the money as we want. And then what we do is we take those manuals and we give them to our frontline operators. Now, depending on the environment we're in, the results change. So if I work in a punitive environment and I say to one of my team, I want you to make this happen. You've got 3 months to be successful. Come back and tell me how it worked. And I want these as the metrics. If I come back in 3 months' time and they know they haven't delivered what I expected and they know that they're going to get punished for it, what happens is they just tell me what was in the documentation. Yeah, it worked, Gareth. That's really good. We got these people through, hit those KPIs. It's awesome. and I am none the wiser as to what's actually going on in the system. But if I co-create this with my supervisors, with my frontline operators, and I design the work around them, not what I think it is, get them to help co-design this, co-create it, and then run some experiments, not trials, not pilots, because they've got baggage associated with them. This is an experiment. Let's see if it works or not. And if we go in with that mindset that sits there and goes, it might or might not, then we're more likely to get a clear understanding. The difference here is psychological safety and just culture. Psychological safety is prospective, proactive. It sets the scene that allows challenges to be raised, to be brought to the fore. It allows mistakes to be made and people reflect on those. It allows contributions of good ideas to happen. But a just culture requires something bad to have happened, an adverse event, so we can discuss it and we can look at it in this mindset that says it absolutely made sense for them to do what they did. If your investigation gets to the stage where you can't answer that question honestly and say, I can see how it made sense, then the investigation needs to go deeper. That gap between work as prescribed, your rules, work as disclosed, what you get told, and work as done is actually what happens, because when something goes wrong, the regulator is going to find out work as done. That gap between those three, is organizational risk. You can't fix a secret, as a friend of mine from Australia, Clive Lloyd, has said. You're never going to get that gap to be zero, but at least you can talk about it and you can shrink it, and then you can manage that uncertainty. And that's the negative side of things. We talk about designing systems to be as good as we can, but things still go wrong. But actually, more goes right than wrong. Why? And the graph on the top left here, we're talking about commercial aviation. Incredibly safe, but it costs a lot of money. And the reason that they invest in that is because of the reputational risk that's associated with it. There's a big high-level regulatory system in place. There's a whole bunch of rules that have to be followed, but it's still people closing the loop, executing activities as well as they can. So in 2015, there's a guy called Eric Hollnagel started a movement around Safety 1 and Safety 2. And the idea here is that why do we just focus on the bad things? Why don't we look at why does work go well most of the time? And I know that that's skewed because we might have a big outcome, and that basically says we can't allow that to happen. I get it. But we also need to understand, how do people adapt? How do they work around? How do they solve those problems dynamically? Safety is a dynamic non-event. You can't count safety. We can count unsafeties, or we can count the conditions that lead to safer operations, but we can't count safety directly. What we can do is put things in place to enhance the performance of those individuals. And in one of my sort of phrases is that safety comes as a byproduct of high performance. We give people technical skills about how to do their jobs. We put them into a context, the operational space, the conditions in which they're in. And we have a lot of freedom to design where they work. And then we have non-technical skills or crew resource management or human factors in an interpersonal skill level. And for us to be successful, we need to have all three of those in place. Now, last week I was in Lund, Sweden, and Eric was presenting, and he made this observation. We talk about safety as an acceptable level of potential risk or harm that's there. And actually, you could probably swap out acceptable to affordable. And that makes it a much more pointed, ethical, moral point that you sit there and say, okay, we can do this, but what's it going to cost us? And are we willing to accept that financial cost for that level of reduction in harm? And making that statement explicit. When I go into organizations and I say, is safety your number one priority? And they go, yes. And I go, no, it's not. As an organization, financial viability is probably up there as your number one priority, because if you don't have it, you fold. Now, that could be a business decision. We can't with all sort of beliefs and hands on our heart to say, we can't carry on doing what we're doing at a level of safety that is acceptable to us, and we will fold the company or fold the business, or we will change what we do. So safety in many cases is not a technical issue. It's a moral and ethical piece that we need to do. So we covered a bit of the theory, talk about the different ways that drift happens. Now move into the practice. What can we do to shift that? How do we get better at what we do? And asking better questions, understanding local rationality, moving from why did they do that to how did it make sense for them to do that? If I ask Nicola, why did you do that? I'm already putting her on the back foot, and I'm asking her to defend her behaviors against mine or the company's standards. But if I say, how did it make sense for you to do that? Now I can work on the decision-making and the context and the conditions, and I'm separating the outcomes and the conditions from the individual. So how did it make sense? The next bit, which is linked to this, is what social, cultural, technical, environmental conditions made this more likely. We can't change the human condition. We are pretty much hardwired in the way we are. We're not going to change those innate behaviors, the creativity, the problem solving, all of the things that go into us being awesome by just, giving us more rules. If the reward mechanism gets in the way of me doing my work, then I'm going to work around the restrictions. I recently out in Mexico at a ports and maritime company, shipping company, and we were doing some train the trainer, and we asked them to present some materials back. And this is an example of how the conditions set. So we watched a video of a team, it was closed circuit TV, watched a video of a train being taken onto a ferry with two bogies, road bogies, to basically take it onto the ferry. And the closed circuit TV, what we saw was a worker go underneath the train carriage on the bogies, underneath to go to the other side of the vehicle. And I was sitting next to the ops director, and I just watched him. His face was like, and a few expletives being expressed. I said, just hold that thought. So we get to the end of the video and we talk about this and we say, what do you think? So why are they taking that risky behavior? I don't understand what's going on. And I said, so how many people are needed to do that job? What are they trying to do in that activity? And so, well, they're trying to prevent it from colliding on the inside of the turn on the outside of the turn. Right, so you need two people. How many people have you got? One. But you've got a schedule to meet because the tide moves and you've got all of this, the timing that happens, it's compressed. So how is one person supposed to get the job done? Because you haven't given them the time and the space. But we have a stop work authority, and that allows us to say to the worker, if you don't think it's safe, stop the work. And so do you think they think it's unsafe? They're actively engaging in this environment. They may not see the bigger picture, but in the here and the now, that worker is looking at the reward element of risk, not just the loss element. And that's an important piece. When we talk about risk, consider what are we rewarding? And that could be, it's not just pay, it's about social credibility, it's about identity. I can get stuff done. That overrides a lot of what the organizations put in place to try and manage the loss element of the risk. So one of the things around asking better questions is as part of an investigation process or an analysis process. And I'm pretty sure most of you will come across the concept of just culture. Originally, James Reason's work, 1994, and creating or engineering a safe culture. And in this space, what he was talking about was an environment where people are going to be looked at in terms of their competencies, their knowledge at that time, but that reckless or sabotage behaviors would not be acceptable. So there's a line between what's acceptable or not. And often it's not about where that line's drawn, it's who draws it. Now, in the safety space, the investigation space, what normally happens with a just culture program or a process or a policy that's there is that the investigation is done by the safety professional, the investigation team. They then write that report through their lens. That report is a synthesis of everything that's there. What's written in that report never actually happened in reality, because it's an assumption of bringing everything together, and there are different perspectives. So we have a report, and then what happens is the organization gets the Just Culture algorithm, and then they flow through. And that algorithm starts with the individual. Did they intend to break the rules? So you're from the outset framing this around the individual. And then you gradually move up into the system, and then you get to the very system end. So the work that this booklet I've put together, and more than happy to share it with anybody who pings me an email afterwards, is going out as a commercial product, but I'm happy to share this PDF out, is you start at the other end. You start at the system. Was the person instructed or influenced by authority? So we start at the highest level, and then we go, were the expectations clear? Did they have the knowledge and skill? Did they intend to act correctly? Were they following common custom and practice? Would a typical peer done the same? Is there evidence of self-interest or disregard for known risk? Is there evidence of intent to cause harm? Those questions 7 and 8 are vanishingly small in terms of the results that are out there. People make sense of the situation they're in, and they're trying to solve the problems and achieve the goals that they're rewarding. And that brings me on to this piece here, is you can't proceduralize a Just Culture. Most organizations have that policy, and they bring it out after the investigation has happened. And they go, how do we treat this individual? That's too late. Those at the workforce, the frontline supervisors, know, because that's what culture is about. It's the hidden assumptions and the meaning making that happens. They know how somebody's going to be dealt with. And so we have to create that environment before an event occurs. So what we're going to do is normalize learning. So most goes right, more goes right than wrong. So we can ask some questions at the end of every day. And I put a post up the other day on LinkedIn. I have way more ideas than I can deal with. And people said, well, you can make a product out of this. I don't have the time or the space to do it. I just want to make things better. So I put out something out there that says, what's to stop an organization at the end of the day protecting 10 or 15 minutes? Because if you as the organization don't protect that time, the workers will run through to the end of the day, or the supervisors will run to the end of the day. So you have to tell them and protect that time. And then we run a short debrief, and we use an audio recorder, a bunch of AI recording tools that are out there. You can use a memo tool, voice memos on your mobile phone. Answer these questions as part of a discussion. What did we do well, and why did it go well? What do we need to improve, and how will we do it? The why it went well and how we do it are the more important questions. Observations are easy. And there's an art and a skill into running an effective debrief to pull the reasons out. And then the final bit is, what surprises did we have, and how do we deal them? No job runs as planned. No plan survives first contact with the enemy, and the enemy is the real world. Your workers, your frontline supervisors, are doing amazing work to solve problems that were not on the plan sheet. And that is hidden knowledge that's out there. And you could capture this. You could then thematically analysis it, using the large language models like Claude or ChatGPT, and pull out some themes. And at the end of the week, do a slightly longer debrief. And at the month, you aggregate these. And what you're finding now is local intelligence about why work is successful at the front line. You could do a more in-detailed or in-depth debrief using this. Define the aims and goals of the task. Did we achieve them? An example, create psychological safety by the leader leading with something that didn't go to plan. If you're asking your teams to be vulnerable, you have to role model that first. If you're asking them to talk about a mistake or an error they've made, they're putting themselves out there. Why would they do that if you haven't role modeled that? Talk about the context. How do we set work up for success or failure? Review of the timeline. That's not really important. People think it is. but it just sets things in place. And then the internal and external questions. What did I do well and why? What do I need to improve and how am I going to do it? What did the team do well and why? And what did the team need to improve and how they're going to do it? And then the final bit is a fix file or follow up. You've done the task, you've executed it, you've just debriefed it. What's going to change? What are the things that we need to take forward? So that's at a task and team level. At an organizational level is looking up and out, looking at a systems view, looking at the elements and how they interact. And what I did is I took the UK National Health Service Systems Engineering for Improved Patient Safety, SEIPS model, and I added a couple of things, which included time and understand the interaction between different elements. Did we have enough time to notice what needed to be done and execute the task? If the time available is less than the task time required, either something's going to go wrong or somebody's going to make a shortcut. And when we're in the office writing these procedures, we have a view as to how things work or don't, as the case may be. When was the last time you went down there and saw the messiness of work? And if people change their behaviors when you arrive on site, that is a lesson in itself. I worked with a big electrical distribution company. They went out to one of their sites and it was a brand new visit by one of the directors, and he got out there. He's like, cool, the guys are coming down the towers. They're coming to see me. It's coffee break. Cool. Next time we went out there, exactly the same thing happened, but it was a different time of day. It's like, what's happening? People change their behaviors based on the trust within the system. And that's on us to create that environment. Asking people to speak up is asking people to put themselves out there. And if you haven't created that psychologically safe or just cultured environment, it's not going to happen. And you will have lots of hidden things. The interactions across the system are really quite important as well. So to conclude, what I would say is that we are awesome. We are so creative, adaptive, malleable. We solve all sorts of problems. And we often break the rules to get that done, to meet the rewards of the organization. And I put here, and sometimes we talk about human error is normal. What we're saying is our performance is variable, that sometimes that suboptimal performance leads to a bad outcome. Sometimes it leads to a discovery and innovation. So just putting a class or a category in there doesn't necessarily help us. Seek to understand how or why things go right most of the time. And we can do that through debriefing at the team and the task level. So when things do go wrong, ask about the local rationality and the conditions. People are trying to do the best they can with the resources they've got. When we view an event from outside the tunnel where people are working, the cognitive tunnel, not a physical tunnel, when we view that outcome, we know what the outcome is and we can join the dots going backwards dead easy. If you're in that tunnel and all you're doing is going forward and I've got a limited visibility about what's happening next, then I don't know until it all goes bang. So you have to put yourself back in time without knowledge of the outcome to say, how did it make sense? And we've got to create a just culture before it happens. Just to say, right, how do we treat this person in terms of the just culture policy? That's not a culture. That's a process and a policy. A culture is how do we feel and how do we make sense and meaning making of the environment. One of the easiest way you can do this, change your language. Move away from some of the counterfactual type stuff. Be curious. And I said here, it costs almost nothing. Yeah, we might need to change some of the paperwork, but fundamentally, in terms of big investment, there's not a lot. And the final bit, be curious. It's really easy to judge when we know the outcome, when we can see the severity. And the more severe the outcome, the harsher we judge it. Because those 5 divers died in the Maldives, it got lots of attention. But actually, that sort of thing happens nearly all the time. In the healthcare space, it's broken. It's quite amazing that more people don't get harmed in the healthcare space. The healthcare professionals are working as hard as they can to deal with that. And Challenger just basically talks about a huge organization that's up against reputational corporation pressures to get stuff done. And the absence of an adverse event does not mean you are safe. When Deepwater Horizon exploded, I can't remember how many years ago now, a number of years ago, there were 11 lives lost. It cost BP $61 billion since then. They were being awarded a lost time injury reward for 7 years without an LTI. Measuring the wrong thing. Make sure that we're dealing with understanding the system and how people interact with that. And that's my final slide. My contact details are on there. And I know that Nicola will send PDF of this deck out. If you want to get hold of the Just Culture Guide or the Debrief Guide, drop us an email and I'll send those back to you. But that is me done. And happy to take questions from the floor, Wendy.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. So we have a couple of questions in. If anybody else wants to send some in, go ahead. So what's the best way to introduce work as done versus work as managed or as imagined to operational managers who think it sounds too academic?
Go out there and see what work looks like. Genuinely, how often do people go out there, find the space, make the white space? I'm dealing with a major distribution company, electrical distribution company, and that's one of the things we're saying is go out there and do site visits. You cannot understand the messiness of work from the office space. And we play a competitive game of Jenga, and people are trying to build a tower as quickly as they can without it falling down. And we say to them, right, if you look top down when we get to the end of it and you've got 3 bricks, that's your KPIs, that's your dashboard. If you just look there, everything looks great. You've got to get out there and look at the side of the tower. You've got to see both sides because it might shift. You've also got to create the environment of curiosity. When you go down there, don't go, why is that not happening? Or that's a breach. You need to sort that out. Just soak it in. Because as I said about those guys coming down the tower, if all you see is the perfect world, you're none the wiser. And you have to build trust over time. It's not a 5-minute job. And on that, I will, the IOGP, the Institute of Oil and Gas Producers, has produced a document called Learning from Normal Work, which I can send across to Nicola, and you can download that for free.
Thanks very much. Gareth, it's a complete turn on its head from so much of what we've all listened to for most of our careers. I think it's something that a lot of people will have to just go away and absorb for sure, but excellent. Next question for you then. How do you balance learning-focused investigations with situations where there has been genuinely reckless behaviour?
I love this question because I would say is, how do you define genuinely reckless? So the bit here is horseplay. Okay, fine. Disciplinary action. That's it's disciplinary action is acceptable, but it shouldn't be the first tool out the box. What I would ask is, from a supervisory point of view, if there's a whole bunch of horseplay going on and people are doing stuff like that, okay, what's the local supervisor doing? Because they should do it. Well, they're probably too busy doing paperwork. So they're trying to tick boxes. Genuine reckless behavior is really, really rare. It's more about a lack of leadership. How much leadership do organizations give to their frontline supervisory staff? And one of the things, I've just written a blog talking about complex, complicated, and simple problems. And what we want to use authority, we can tell people, we can use management, we can use processes to solve a wicked problem. You've got to go out there and develop leadership. And it's not a simple solution. But I'm more than happy if that question asker has got a scenario, I'm more than happy to discuss that because it's much easier to look into detail rather than generalities.
Yeah, thank you. There's quite a few questions popping in here now.
That's cool. I love these.
How do we introduce or reintroduce consequence when it has been eroded?
Oh, interesting. So my first question is, do you think people intend to go to work to do a bad job? And so that's the first bit is, understand the local rationality. There is a massive amount of evidence that says punishment doesn't solve problems. What we have to understand is the local rationality of what's going on. Now, we talk about accountability is just often used as another word of blame. So if you get somebody to tell their story, their context-rich story, their trade-offs and their tensions in what they're operating, you will learn something too, and you'll understand what's going on. If the system makes it easier to do the wrong thing, people will do that. So sometimes we've got to put interlocks in place, we've got to put controls in place, but that costs an organization time and money to do that. Consequence rarely changes the system's behaviors. Well, actually what it does is it drives the learning underground, because most of the operators know that they're trying to do the best they can, the system's broken, and they get caught when the system finally fails. And we have this concept called useful illegality. Everybody knows the rules are being broken because it's the only way to get the job done. But when the proverbial hits the fan, if you're the last one standing there holding it, you go, well, you're it. And everybody else goes, thank God it wasn't me. So it's that bit of creating the environment so actually we can find out those events before they go wrong.
Okay.
Okay, next one then. What is the best way or metrics to judge where the safety culture in an organization is to demonstrate advancement?
Well, for a start, you can't quantitatively measure a culture. And I know there's lots of people out there go, hey, we've got a safety culture survey, off you go. One of the ways that we try and do it is we use a tool and we know it's broken, but we use it differently. So you may have come across the Bradley curve or the DuPont model, DuPont curve. We use that as a discussion piece. We don't use it to put points on there. So we have a conversation. Where do you think at a team level you are? And then you have a discussion why. What would take you to move into other spaces? What's an acceptable safety culture? What's tolerated? How does an organization tolerate the trade-offs that exist between money, between resource, and between acceptable performance? And are they willing to hear the bad news? When the story comes from the floor and it says, this sucks, this is broken, it needs to be fixed, and the message comes down and says, productivity is king, that's your message. That's where your safety culture is. And that's why I said, safety is our number one priority. Really? And I have a piece that I can share around zero harm, because I know a number of organizations have that. Just because zero harm never works, because you're never going to get to zero. But what we can do is hold it as a trajectory to go somewhere and sit there and go, we will design systems recognizing we want to get to zero, but we know the system is fallible and things will go wrong. How do we fail safely?
Thank you.
Okay. How do you approach the investigation of an incident where not following an SOP is written on the disciplinary procedure as leading to a warning, but you feel that it would be more effective at an individual level and to improve the health and safety culture to focus on the retraining for both the individual and all relevant employees?
So my answer would be, it's in the question. So if your health and safety investigation policy says this is what the outcome is, rewrite the policy. And that safety culture guide, you basically start at the system. So my first question is, who wrote the procedure? Who tested the procedure? Was it written for optimal conditions? Was this 3 o'clock in the morning in a pouring rain, really cold, and you're asking to read 8-point font in the dark? And how many steps are in place to understand that? And the bit about training, often if you do a fairly standard root cause analysis, the two most likely outcomes are more training, better supervision. And that doesn't really help anything, because the training, if you ask people, did they understand what they were supposed to do? Yes. What were the conditions that made it hard to do the right thing? That's the question we need to dig into. So yeah, I can provide some links for that if you want to get hold of me. But fundamentally, look at the system, look up and out, and what makes sense for people to do what they did at that time.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know where you would stop with the next one. Where do you see the biggest misunderstanding of human factors in the UK at the minute?
So the simple answer is, what is human factors? So I recently wrote a piece that was based on something from Steve Shorrock, the 4 ways of looking at human factors. So the first bit is the human factor. And invariably that ends up blaming the individual for their behaviors without understanding how and why they behaved the way they did. Then we talk about the factors of humans. And often that's around what goes in my head, my cognitive work, my communication, my interpersonal skills. And then we talk about factors affecting humans. So that's stress, fatigue, ergonomics, shaping our performance. And then the final one, which is what I spend a lot of my time in, is social technical systems. How do I interact, in my own head, with other people, with the environment, with a process, and to achieve the goals that are out there? So the first bit is, what do you mean by human factors? And that would be, I would say, my biggest bit. And the same probably goes with interchangeably with human error. That's often the first definition. It's human factor. It's just human error. Human error is a classification to start looking into how it made sense. It's not a cause of an accident.
Thank you.
Next one through is, how do you balance operational delivery with creating pace for learning?
So you go back and you say, do you want to keep on making the same mistakes? A friend of mine works for the Dutch Railways. He took over as the head of health and safety, and he was basically writing the same things in all the reports. And it was distracted driver. So 50 reports in a year, root cause 50, distracted driver. Hang on a minute, we've got to do something differently. So he basically went to his boss and said, I can do copy and paste each time if you want, or we can sit there and triage and we can work on what are the best reports we want to focus on. What's the best learning outputs? And then go back to the organization and say, how much time are we spending doing rework, or people leaving, or having to retrain people? All of those things have a cost to the business. And I can pretty much guarantee the organizations I've dealt with, and they're pretty big ones, they don't track what that changeover cost is. If you get rid of somebody and then retrain and bring them in, what's involved in that space?
Okay, next one then. You talked about the move away from a focus on the individual to start with the quality of the systems. Mm-hmm. I've been working on ADHD and practical drift, having previously worked in the context of healthcare systems change. What fascinates me about ADHD is that it shows how person-led variables can have a big impact on the levels of situation awareness in a system. How can we maintain that balance of system awareness and individual awareness?
Have conversations. And I would, it's a simple answer, but it's making sure that you bring a diverse perspective into any of the conversations you have. When we talk about running a learning team, we'll talk about those at the sharp end who are directly involved, their supervisors, and then we take normally one person from different layers in the organization who are impacting that. And what happens now is those at the top end see the struggles down there. And conversely, those at the sharp end see what happens up here as well and the trade-offs they're having to deal with. And I put myself somewhere on this spectrum of just being out there really energetic, and whether or not I'm not diagnosed as ADHD, but I'm probably somewhere out there. And that gives me a very different view to the world, and use those people in a prospective way. And for the others who are getting that narrative, getting those stories, listen to what they're saying, because their perception, their reality is real. And use that. And there was a LinkedIn post about a week ago talking about using people who are somewhere on the neurodivergent spectrum to the benefit of the organization.
Thanks, Gareth.
What question can we ask that traditional investigation approaches often miss?
What makes it hard to do your job well? I was doing, and I've got a piece about better questions again. I can send across. The bit about what makes it hard to do. I was asked to do some supervision for a master's degree where the student was going to ask a bunch of military divers, "Why do you break the rules?" It's like, you are never going to get an answer to that. But if you ask the question, what makes it hard to do the job to the level that you want to do it, now you're going to find the constraints and the challenges that they face.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, I think I've got the last one here now, Gareth. So frontline management ownership, how do you really improve this? They have so many competing responsibilities, but safety seems to fall below production most times. When education, coaching, and structure have been implemented, but attitude isn't changing.
So I love that, because I would ask the question, actually, what did you do to help develop those managers into leaders? I feel very privileged. You know, I had 25 years in the Royal Air Force. If I tot it up, I probably had 2.5, 3 years of dedicated professional team and leadership development. If you go into an organization, you might get a day or half a day as leadership, and it's an online process that actually, if we want our leaders, our frontline leaders, to be effective, the next level up needs to protect the time. So if you're tasking your frontline managers at 95% and then you give them some extra stuff, what do they drop? You have to help them to be successful. That's why I was saying about protecting debrief time, site visit time. And when your site manager comes to you and says, "I'm going out there and I can't get that job done, the job you want me to do because I'm visiting the site," the response is, "Okay, let's sort it out a different way." But your relationships with your frontline operators are key, because they're your source of intelligence. So it's easy to say, you should try harder, but what am I doing to make my subordinates, my team be successful? And ask them what it is that they need to be successful. Not what you think it is. What do they need?
It's totally right. It's all about mentoring and development, isn't it? The whole way through your career, you're still learning and you're relying on people who have done the job probably longer than you have. So excellent.
And just on that bit then is giving the organization, giving white space for that development to happen. So it's about the mentoring. And yes, there is lots of informal learning that happens. But as the question writer said, they are always in tension with other things. And I would argue that, you know, competing with safety, well, what does safety mean when it comes to running the business? Is it about developing the conditions so that safety emergencies or safe operations emerge? Or is it about doing safety clutter or safety theatre? It's about filling in checklists and surveys and forms and things like that. Is that actually making the work safe? Or is it about having a conversation to say, what gets in the way of you doing a good job? What do you need from me to be successful?
Thanks, Gareth.
Okay, so that's all the questions answered that came through. So thank you again, Gareth, for presenting today. And if anyone on the webinar has colleagues that you think would benefit from watching this webinar, it will be uploaded shortly to the members area of our website, and Nicola will send out information when this has actually been done. To non-members attending today, can I thank you for attending and to think about becoming a member. And then that's the end of today's webinar. So thank you very much for joining us. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and we will see you at the August group meeting. Thank you.